Dear students, today we will continue reading Mother's Day, a play written by John Boynton Presley. We know that a play is a work of drama, and drama is a very good and forceful medium for conveying a social message. It raises the issues which are common in today's world and makes them clear to everyone. We know that when we hear something, we retain a little. When we read, we retain some more. But when we see, we remember the most. A play, when enacted effectively, plays a vital role in conveying a social message. The main issue that the play raises is that the lady of the house, who is just like an axis around which everything revolves, is never given the respect, especially if she is simple and timid. The author uses the dramatic act very convincingly to highlight certain social issues. The basic issue is the exploitation of housewives and mothers of the families. The second issue it raises is that the mistress of the house should assert her position very firmly to the family members. She should be ready to put across her views with determination rather than simply surrender to their demands. It is best to read a play in one uninterrupted sitting without any distractions, such as television, music, or the telephone. This, of course, is the way in which the theater audience will eventually experience a play. Before reading the play, we should study the cast list in order to best understand the relationships of the characters. When reading the play, seek to understand the storyline and to develop a gut reaction to the play. And don't worry about understanding the play. It is only with time, reflection, and repeated readings that the answers to all the questions can be answered. If necessary, look up for any words, terms, or expressions with which you are unfamiliar. After some time and thought, additional readings can be very enlightening. Staged readings performed by trained actors enable us to better visualize a performance. We hear the actors speaking the words, and to a limited extent, we might see them moving about the stage. Although we are still missing many elements of performance, the play can be better revealed through this method. These are our main characters. Mrs. Annie Pearson is a housewife, she is a mother, and she is pleasant but shy and low on self-esteem. Her excessive love and care has spoiled her 2 children and husband. Another character is George Pearson. George Pearson is her husband. He is not as respected in his circle as expected. He dominates his wife. Another character is Doris Pearson. She is their daughter. She is about 20 years old and she fails to understand her mother's struggle and doesn't help her in housework. Another character is Cyril, who is Mrs. Pearson's son and who is equally demanding and never sympathizes with his mother. And there is Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Fitzgerald is their neighbor. She has a strong will and she knows magic. She helps Mrs. Pearson to reform the spoiled members of Mrs. Pearson's family. So Mrs. Pearson, a devoted housewife in her 40s, appears to be a gentle lady with low self-esteem. And in spite of being ignored by her family members, she enjoys serving them and endures everything without any murmur or protest. She is aware that they are thoughtless and selfish, but she says that she would like to discuss it openly but doesn't know where to start. This is where her neighbor will help her. Her neighbor is Mrs. Fitzgerald. The play opens in the living room of the Pearson's family. There is Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Pearson. Mrs. Fitzgerald is her neighbor. She is older and heavier compared to Annie and has a strong and dominating personality. Unlike Annie, who speaks in a light, soft tone with a local touch of suburban cockney, Mrs. Fitzgerald has a deep voice with an Irish tone. The play opens with Mrs. Fitzgerald telling Mrs. Pearson's fortune. Mrs. Fitzgerald considers that Mrs. Pearson is responsible herself for spoiling her husband and children. It does neither good to her nor her family. She takes their orders as if she were their servant, and she stays home every night while they go out enjoying themselves. Mrs. Fitzgerald finds that this is the cause of Mrs. Pearson's misery. Mrs. Fitzgerald's husband was posted in the East. It means the British colonies in Asia for 12 years. So she utilized some time there by learning fortune telling, and she also learned how to use magic spells to exchange personalities. In this play, she will use this knowledge in temporarily exchanging her strong personality with the weak personality of Mrs. Annie Pearson in order to resolve her problem with her family. Mrs. Pearson hesitates, but then finally she agrees. Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Pearson will exchange their personalities using the magic spell. And the first person who will face the mother's anger will be her daughter, Doris. So Mrs. Fitzgerald sends Mrs. Pearson home to her house, and she herself stays with Pearsons. First one is Doris. First one who will get a surprise is Doris, Mrs. Fitzgerald's 20-year-old daughter. Doris is her spoiled daughter. She's a pretty girl in her early 20s, and she expects her mother to do all the tasks without questioning, and she never offers to help. Doris is very surprised to hear her mother talking in this way. She can hardly believe her ears. Mrs. Pearson will also talk rudely about her boyfriend, and Doris will cry. Doris will cry a lot. After some time, Cyril comes in. After Doris runs out, Cyril Pearson enters the room. Cyril is Annie's son. He treats his mother with indifference. He expects all his commands to be done with utmost urgency. He lacks any concern for his mother and tries to portray himself as a busy man. Cyril is also very surprised by the way his mother behaves. Suddenly, both Doris and Cyril can see their mother in a completely different light. They can see her smoking and playing cards. These were some remarkable changes in Mrs. Pearson's behavior that shocked her family members. She was casually drinking beer and she hadn't carried out any of the work she normally did, like making tea for the family and ironing their clothes. So Cyril and Doris at one moment think that maybe she has gone mad. Maybe she had fallen down and hit her head. Perhaps that's why she's behaving this way. After dismissing Doris's and Cyril's request, next person who will come in is George. George is Annie's husband. He is about 50 years old. He is heavy and slow-moving. George thinks too much of himself and makes his wife do whatever he commands. So, George Pearson enters. He is about 50, fundamentally decent but solemn, self-important and pompous. Preferably, he should be a heavy, slow-moving type. He notices Doris' tears. Pompous means arrogant. So George Pearson enters and he says, "Hello, what is this?" Can't be anything to cry about, because he notices that Doris is crying. And Doris, through sobs, sobbing and weeping, she says, "You'll see." Doris runs out left with a sob or two on the way. George stares after her a moment, then looks at Mrs. Pearson. George is looking intently at Doris, who is running away, sobbing. And he says, "Did she say you'll see?" Because he still doesn't understand. And Mrs. Pearson, who is now Mrs. Fitzgerald in Mrs. Pearson's body, she says yes. What did she mean? Better ask her. So George looks slowly again at the door, then at Mrs. Pearson. Then he notices the stout, the strong beer that Mrs. Pearson raises for another sip. His eyes almost bulge. Here, George notices that his wife is drinking and he is very surprised. So after Doris goes out, sobbing means crying noisily, taking sudden deep breaths. After he sees that Doris is crying, he is a bit surprised. And then he notices that his wife is drinking the stout, the beer. His eyes almost bulge. To bulge means to stick out, to swell. And he says, "Stout?" "Yes." George is amazed. "What are you drinking stout for?" "Because I fancied some." She says, "Because I felt like having some." To fancy something means to feel a desire or liking for something. He asks her, At this time of day? Yes, what's wrong with it at this time of day? George is bewildered. Bewildered means baffled or perplexed. He's confused and greatly surprised. He says, "Nothing, I suppose, Annie, but I've never seen you do it before." And the answer he gets is, "Well, you're seeing me now." George, with heavy distaste means with very strong dislike or bitterly. So bitterly, George says, "Yes, and I don't like it. It doesn't look right. I'm surprised at you." "Well, that ought to be a nice change for you." "What do you mean?" "It must be some time since you were surprised at me, George." And George says, "I don't like surprises. I'm all for a study going on. You ought to know that by this time. By the way, I forgot to tell you this morning I wouldn't want any tea. Special snooker match night at the club tonight, and a bit of supper going. So no tea." So George says he doesn't like surprises. He's all for a steady going on. A steady going on means something balanced, unchanging. He doesn't like surprises. So he says, "I forgot to tell you this morning I wouldn't want any tea. There is a special snooker match. Snooker match night. Snooker is a game similar to billiard." And George says, "I will not be needing any tea. There will be also a bit of supper going. He will be having dinner at the club. So no tea." His wife, or at least the person he thinks it's his wife, Mrs. Pearson, tells him that's all right. There isn't any. There isn't any means there isn't any tea as well. So George is astonished. He is very surprised. He says, "You mean you didn't get any ready?" "Yes, and a good thing too, as it turned out." She says, "Yes, you're right. I haven't made any tea, and it turns out to be a good thing." George is aggrieved. He's feeling hurt, angry. Aggrieved means feeling resentment at having been unfairly treated. He's discontented. He says, "That's all very well, but suppose I'd wanted some." He says, "That's all fine, but suppose, let's imagine I wanted some tea. Then what?" And she says, "My goodness, listen to the man. Annoyed because I don't get a tea for him that he doesn't even want. Haven't ever tried that at the club." And he says, "Tried what at the club?" She tells him, "Going up to the bar and telling them you don't want a glass of beer, but you are annoyed because they haven't already poured it out. Try that on them and see what you get." He says, "I don't know what you are talking about." Mrs. Pearson tells him they'd laugh at you even more than they do now. Here, Mrs. Pearson tells him, "This is incredible. You should try this at the club. You should go to the bar and you should tell them you don't want a glass of beer, but you are annoyed because they haven't already poured it out." She also tells him that they would laugh at him even more than they do now. George says, "Laugh at me? They don't laugh at me." He says this indignantly. Indignantly means in a displeased tone, a bit angrily. "Of course they do. You ought to have found that out by this time. anybody else would have done. You're one of their standing jokes, famous. They call you Pompey Umpy Pearson because they think you're so slow and pompous. And George is horrified. He says, never. Here, Mrs. Pearson, who is actually Mrs. Fitzgerald in Mrs. Pearson's body, tells George that everyone is making fun of him at the club, and still he goes there every night. She says, you are one of their standing jokes. Standing joke means some kind of permanent amusement, something that regularly causes amusement or provokes ridicule. She says, they think you are so slow and pompous, so slow and arrogant, self-important. And George says, never. George is horrified. He doesn't believe it. Here we can see how much George thinks of himself and how much he thinks about his wife. He makes her do whatever he commands. That is why he told her that he didn't expect her to drink strong beer and that she should follow his instructions and stop drinking it. George has dominated his wife so far, so he didn't expect this kind of behavior from her. His male ego suffers a jolt when he comes to know that his wife hasn't kept tea ready for him. Whether he will drink it or not, she should have kept his tea ready like an obedient servant. George is always at the club at night and spends little time with his wife. So Mrs. Pearson, who is actually Mrs. Fitzgerald, ridicules him that he has become a standing joke for the people at the club. They call him Pompey Umpy Pearson because they think he is so slow and pompous. Upon hearing this, he loses his temper and glares at her helplessly. Mrs. Pearson continues. It's always beaten me why you should want to spend so much time at a place where they're always laughing at you behind your back and calling you names, leaving your wife at home night after night, instead of going out with her, who doesn't make you look a fool. Mrs. Pearson tells him, it's always beaten me. It's always beaten me is a phrase of beat. It's a slang. It means that I've never understood. Why would you want to spend so much time at a place where they're always laughing at you behind your back and calling you names? You leave your wife at home night after night instead of going out with her, because she doesn't make fun of you. She doesn't make you look a fool. She doesn't laugh behind your back. In this moment, Cyril enters right, with a glass of milk in one hand and a thick slice of cake in the other. George, almost dazed, turns to him appealingly. After Cyril enters, George, almost dazed means astonished, dazzled, or in a confused state. He turns to him appealingly. Appealingly means in an appealing manner, in a requesting manner. And he asks him, here, Cyril, you've been with me to the club once or twice. They don't laugh at me and call me Pompey Umpy Pearson, do they? Cyril is embarrassed, so he hesitates. He waits for a while. And then he says angrily, go on, tell me, do they? George wants to know, is it true that people in the club are making fun of him? So he asks Cyril. Cyril is embarrassed. So he says, well, yes, Dad, I'm afraid they do. Now George slowly looks from one to the other, staggered. Staggered means amazed, astonished, deeply shocked. He looks from one to the other, from Cyril towards his wife. And then slowly he says, "Well, I'll be damned." "I'll be damned" is an informal and impolite expression of complete surprise. It is used to show that one is very surprised about something. "I'll be damned." Damned means ruined. So George exits left slowly, almost as if somebody had hit him over the head. He's so surprised to hear this, and he's coming out almost as if somebody had hit him over the head. His head might be bent down. Cyril, after watching him, turns indignantly to Mrs. Pearson. Indignantly means in an angry way, because he thinks that something is unfair about this. Indignantly means in a manner indicating anger or annoyance at something perceived as unfair. Indignantly is an adverb. So he turns to his mother and he says, "Now, you shouldn't have told him that, Mom. That's not fair. You've hurt his feelings. Mine too." He says, "This is not fair. This is not just. You shouldn't have told him that. You have hurt his feelings and you have hurt mine feelings too." To hurt somebody's feelings means to make someone feel bad, to upset someone. And his mother tells him, sometimes it does people good to have their feelings hurt. She says, sometimes it is good if their feelings get hurt. The truth oughtn't to hurt anybody for long. She says, the truth should not hurt anybody for long. If your father didn't go to the club so often, perhaps they stopped laughing at him. And Cyril says, glumly, I doubt it. Glumly means sadly or in an unhappy way. So Cyril also agrees that even if George wasn't to go to the club so often, they would still make fun of him. No, his mother says severely. Severely means seriously or gravely. She says, possibly you do, but what I doubt is whether your opinion is worth having. She says, yeah, maybe you think this way, but what I'm doubting is whether your opinion has any value. And she continues saying, what do you know? Nothing. You spend too much time and good money at greyhound races and dirt tracks and ice shows. Greyhound races are races run by tall, slender dogs. It's a sport in which greyhound race around a circular or oval track in pursuit of a moving dummy. She also tells him that he spends time and good money on dirt tracks. Dirt tracks means racing courses for motorcycles. And ice shows. These are things in which Cyril apparently enjoys. Ice shows means entertainment shows performed by ice skaters. Cyril is sulking. Sulkily means showing an irritating feeling in a way that is sulky. Sulky means refusing to smile or be pleasant to people, usually because you are angry about something. So he says, well, what if I do? I've got to enjoy myself somehow, haven't I? He tells her, I have to enjoy myself. And she says, I wouldn't mind so much if you were really enjoying yourself. But are you? And where is it getting you? What's the point of all this? Where is it getting you? Where is it gets you is an idiom. It means it's not making any difference. So suddenly there is a sharp, hurried knocking heard off left. Somebody is knocking the door. Cyril says, "Might be for me, I'll see." So Cyril hurries out left, and in a moment he re-enters. He comes again, closing the door behind him. And he says, "It is that silly old bag from next door, Mrs. Fitzgerald. You don't want her here, do you?" Silly old bag means unpleasant elderly woman. If someone calls a woman an old bag or a stupid bag, they are insulting her. So Cyril asks his mother. He says, "You don't want her here, do you?" And his mother says, sharply, means intensely. She says, "Certainly I do. Of course I want her here. Ask her in," means ask her to come in. And don't call her a silly old bag either. She's a very nice woman with a lot more sense than you'll ever have. Sense means intellect or understanding. She says she's a very nice woman with a lot more intellect than you'll ever have. Ask her to come in. So Cyril exits left, and Mrs. Pearson finishes her stout, her beer, and she's smacking her lips. Smacking lips means bringing lips together with force so that they make a sound. Cyril re-enters left. He reappears again, ushering in Mrs. Fitzgerald. To usher in means to bring in. He is coming inside with Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually his mother, Mrs. Pearson. Mrs. Fitzgerald hesitates in the doorway. She is waiting. She is delaying. She pauses because she is coming inside her house and she must be wondering what has happened in her absence. Come in, Mrs. Fitzgerald." So Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually Mrs. Pearson, she is moving to left center anxiously. Anxiously means in an anxious way. "I just wondered if everything is all right." And Cyril is saying in a sulky way, "No, it isn't." Mrs. Pearson corrects him. She says, "Of course it is. You be quiet." Cyril is saying indignantly and loudly, "Why should I be quiet?" And Mrs. Pearson is shouting now. She says, "Because I tell you to. You should be quiet because I tell you to be quiet. You silly, spoiled, young piken." Piken refers to a stupid or foolish person. On hearing this, Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually Cyril's mother, she's protesting nervously. She says, "Oh no, Shirley." She wants to find some excuse. We remember very well that she doesn't like unpleasant situations. And after all, Cyril is her son. Mrs. Pearson, who is actually Mrs. Fitzgerald, says, "Now, Mrs. Fitzgerald, just let me manage my family in my own way, please." She doesn't want her to interfere. "Yes, but Cyril," and Cyril is, again, sulky and glowering. He's angry. Glowering means looking angrily. It means to have an angry or sullen look on the face, to frown or to scowl. Cyril says, "Mr. Cyril Pearson, to you please, Mrs. Fitzgerald," because he doesn't understand that this is his mother, and Mrs. Fitzgerald, out of habit, calls him Cyril. So Cyril stalks off into the kitchen. He marches out into the kitchen. Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually Mrs. Pearson, is moving to the settee, whispering, "Oh dear, what's happening?" And Mrs. Pearson tells her calmly, "Nothing much, just putting them in their places, that's all. Doing what you ought to have done long since." Putting them in their places is an expression which means I'm making them behave properly. To put someone in their place means to do or say something to show that someone who is in question is not better than other people and should not be acting in such a proud way. So she says, "I'm just putting them in their places, that's all. I'm doing what you were supposed to do. I'm doing what you were to do long before. You were supposed to do this before." "Is George home?" she asks, and she sits next to her. "Yes, I've been telling him what they think of him at the club." "Well, they think a lot of him, don't they?" "No, they don't, and now he knows it." Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually Mrs. Pearson, is not happy to hear this. She finds out that Mrs. Fitzgerald, the real Mrs. Fitzgerald, has been talking to her husband, and she finds out that she told her husband that people are calling him names at the club. And she says, "Oh dear, I wish you hadn't, Mrs. Fitzgerald." And she says, "Nonsense. Doing them all a world of good. Doing them all a world of good means I'm helping them to learn how to behave properly." An expression to do somebody a world of good means that someone is made to feel better or something has improved someone's life. And she says, "And they'll be eating out of your hand soon. You'll see." To eat out of somebody's hand means to be completely controlled by someone. If you have someone eating out of your hand, it means they are completely under your control. They will do whatever you want. And Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually Mrs. Pearson, she says, "I don't think I want them eating out of my hand." She says, "I don't think I want that." And Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is in Mrs. Pearson's body, she's impatient. She says, "Well, whatever you want, they'll be doing it, all three of them. Mark my words, Mrs. Pearson." She says, "Whatever you want, they will be doing it, all three of them. Mark my words." Mark my words means pay attention and remember what I'm saying, because it is going to happen. They will all stop misbehaving and they will do whatever you want. Now George again enters, and he is unpleasantly surprised when he sees the visitor. He moves to the armchair left, sits down heavily, and glumly lights his pipe. Then he looks from Mrs. Pearson to Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is regarding him anxiously. Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald are sitting there. Mrs. Fitzgerald is regarding him anxiously. She is very anxious because this is her husband. So after George enters in a moody way, in a dejected way, he is unpleasantly surprised to see them sitting. He is surprised to see the visitor. So he moves to the armchair. Armchair is a large, comfortable chair with side supports for a person's arms. And he sits down heavily and he lights his pipe. Pipe is a device for smoking tobacco. And he says, "Just looked it for a minute, I suppose, Mrs. Fitzgerald." He says to Mrs. Fitzgerald, "Oh, Mrs. Fitzgerald, you just looked in for a minute." It means to drop by. He wants to tell her that she's not really wanted in the house. And Mrs. Fitzgerald says, who doesn't know what she is saying, she says, "Well, yes, I suppose so, George." She calls him George, because she's his wife and she's used to call him George. And George is aghast. Aghast means he's very surprised. He's very puzzled to hear Mrs. Fitzgerald call him George. So Mrs. Fitzgerald nervously says, "Oh, I'm sorry." She realizes her mistake. Now, Mrs. Pearson, who is of course Mrs. Fitzgerald says, "What does it matter? Your name is George, isn't it? Who do you think you are? Duke of Edinburgh?" She's making fun of him. She says, "Why are you getting insulted? Your name is George, right? So why are you insulted? Whom do you think you are? Duke of Edinburgh?" And George says angrily, "What's he got to do with it? Just tell me that. What does Duke of Edinburgh has to do with this?" He doesn't understand her jokes. He doesn't understand the way she's expressing, because this is somebody else in his wife's body, and he never heard his wife talking this way. He says, "And isn't it bad enough without her calling me George? Isn't it bad enough without this? Naughty Pompey Pearson, and poor Doris has been crying her eyes out upstairs." Yes, crying her eyes. He says, "Isn't it bad enough without this? There is no tea. I find out they call me Pompey Pearson. Poor Doris has been crying her eyes upstairs." Crying her eyes means to cry one's heart out. We can also say cry one's heart out. It means to weep excessively in an uncontrolled way. To cry very bitterly, very hard. Mrs. Fitzgerald is wailing. Wailing means she's making some prolonged, high-pitched sound. She says, "Oh dear, I ought to have known." And George is staring at her, annoyed. He's surprised she's saying, "I ought to have known. I could have known." He says, "You ought to have known? Why ought you to have known? Nothing to do with you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Look, we are at sixes and sevens here just now, so perhaps you'll excuse us." He tells her, "What are you talking about? What do you mean by this? I could have known. Nothing to do with you. This has nothing to do with you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Look, we are at sixes and sevens." We are at sixes and sevens means a disorder. This is a phrase which means chaotic, disorganized, in a state of total confusion. Here we are in a state of chaos, and perhaps you will excuse us. However, before Mrs. Fitzgerald can reply, Mrs. Pearson says, I won't excuse you, George Pearson. Next time a friend and neighbor comes to see me, just say something when you see her. Good evening, or how do you do, or something. And don't just march in and sit down without a word. It's bad manners. She says, I won't excuse you, because this is not the way one should behave. Next time a friend or a neighbor comes to see me, you should say something. You should say, good evening, or how do you do, anything. Don't just march in and sit down without a word. These are bad manners. And Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually Mrs. Pearson, says, no, it's all right, because she's not very fond of discussing things. No, it isn't all right. We'll have some decent manners in this house, or I'll know the reason why. And she's staring at George. Well, and he says, well, what? He's intimidated. Means he's frightened, terrorized. To intimidate means to frighten or overawe someone, especially in order to make them do what one wants. He says, well, what? Mrs. Pearson is teasing him. She's taunting him. Why don't you get off to your club? Special night tonight, isn't it? They'll be waiting for you, wanting to have a good laugh. Go on then, don't disappoint them. She's teasing him. She's taunting him. She says, why don't you go to your club? Why don't you get off? To get off means why don't you start going to your club and enjoy over there? They must be waiting to have a good laugh. Go on, don't disappoint them. And George says bitterly, that's right, make me look silly in front of her now. Go on, don't mind me, he says. Yes, that's right. Now make me look foolish in front of her. Go on, don't mind me. Don't mind me being here. 6s and 7s. Complete chaos. Poor Doris been crying her eyes out, getting the neighbors in to see the fun. He says, why are you getting the neighbors in to see the fun? And then, suddenly losing his temper, he's staring at Mrs. Pearson and shouting, all right, let her hear it. What's the matter with you? Have you gone barmy or what? Then he gives up and he says, all right, let her hear everything. I don't care. And he says to his wife, what's the matter with you? Have you gone barmy? Barmy means crazy, insane. Have you gone mad or what? And Mrs. Pearson, his wife, is jumping up savagely. She jumps up in a fierce way. Savagely means to a very great and severe degree. She gets up and she says, if you shout at me again like that, George Pearson, I'll slap your big fat silly face. This is something that he must have never heard before from his wife. She tells him, if you shout again like that, I will slap your big fat silly face. And Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually Mrs. Pearson, is not feeling very well. She's moaning. She's making some low sound. She's crying in pain. And she says, oh, no, please, Mrs. Fitzgerald. And Mr. Pearson sits. Mrs. Pearson, the real Mrs. Pearson, doesn't feel very comfortable in this situation. George is staring at her, bewildered. And he says, either I'm off my chump or you two are. How do you mean? No, please, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Look, you are Mrs. Fitzgerald. Again, Mrs. Pearson, who is in Mrs. Fitzgerald's body, she calls Mrs. Pearson Mrs. Fitzgerald, whereas she's Mrs. Fitzgerald. They have changed the personalities. So George says, either I'm off my chump or you two are. I'm off my chump means crazy or insane. It means either I'm crazy or insane or you are. How do you mean? No, please, Mrs. Fitzgerald. You are Mrs. Fitzgerald, so why are you telling yourself to stop when you are not doing anything? Tell her to stop. Then there'd be some sense in it. He's confused because he doesn't understand what's happening. Why is Mrs. Fitzgerald calling his wife Mrs. Fitzgerald? He's staring at Mrs. Pearson, whom he thinks it's his wife, and he says, I think you must be tiddly. Tiddly means slightly drunk. Mrs. Pearson tells him, say that again, George Pearson. And he feels again intimidated. And he says, all right. At this moment, Doris enters. She enters looking miserable. Next time, we will find out what happened with the family. Were there any changes? And what happened to Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Pearson? Have they exchanged and reversed their personalities back? Dear students, this is all for today. Have a good day and see you soon.